Get off my lake immediately or I'm calling the police. The HOA president was screaming at me from my own cabin deck, her face red with fury. This entitled Karen actually believed she owned the entire lake and had the authority to kick me off my own property. When I calmly refused to budge, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right in front of me. The police officer who arrived 20 minutes later took one look at my property deed and stared at her like she'd completely lost her mind. But what I discovered buried in my family's history would flip this whole situation upside down and make this power-hungry woman wish she had never crossed paths with me. I'm David Mitchell, and at 52, I thought my days of dealing with corporate drama were finally over. After 25 years climbing the ladder at a Fortune 500 company in Chicago, I'd saved enough to buy a modest lakeside cabin in rural Wisconsin and live out my dream of peaceful retirement. No more board meetings, no more office politics, no more stress-induced migraines. Just me, my fishing rod, and endless mornings watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold. The cabin I found was perfect for my needs. A cozy two-bedroom structure sitting on what the real estate agent described as prime waterfront property with private lake access. The price was reasonable. The location was secluded, and the previous owners had left it in excellent condition. I closed on the property in March and spent the first month just decompressing from decades of corporate life, finally feeling like I could breathe again. Everything was perfect until that Tuesday morning in late April, when my peaceful world got turned upside down by a woman who clearly had too much time on her hands and an inflated sense of her own authority. I was sitting on my small wooden dock with my morning coffee, casting my line into the perfectly still water. The lake was like glass, reflecting the clear blue sky, and I was thinking about how this was exactly what happiness felt like. No deadlines, no demanding clients, no conference calls at 6 in the morning, just the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the possibility of catching dinner. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive car engine roaring up the gravel road behind my cabin. The engine cut off abruptly. A door slammed with unnecessary force, and I heard the click-clack of high heels marching across wooden boards. Before I could even turn around to see what was happening, a voice cut through the morning silence like a chainsaw. "Excuse me? This is private property. You cannot fish here." I turned around to see a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a suburban nightmare. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer outfit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and an expression of righteous indignation that suggested she was personally offended by my existence. She was standing on my deck, hands on her hips, glaring at me like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. I set down my coffee cup and stood up slowly, trying to process what was happening. "I'm sorry, but I'm fishing from my own property. I own this cabin and the shoreline." Her eyes narrowed and her voice got even shriller. "No, you absolutely do not. I'm Rebecca Sterling, president of the Lakeview Homeowners Association, and I'm telling you that this lake is exclusive community property. You're trespassing and I want you gone immediately." I stared at this woman, trying to understand how someone could be so confident about something so obviously wrong. I'd bought this property fair and square, had all the paperwork, paid the taxes. There was absolutely no doubt that I owned the land I was standing on. Yet this Rebecca woman was acting like she had some kind of legal authority over my property. "Ma'am, I have the deed to this property. I bought it 3 months ago. You're welcome to see the documentation if you'd like, but I'm definitely not trespassing." That's when she really lost it. Rebecca pulled out her phone and started recording me, holding it up like some kind of weapon. "I'm documenting this violation for legal purposes. You're destroying our property values and disturbing our exclusive community amenities. This is going to court." The whole situation was so absurd that I almost started laughing. Here was a grown woman having a meltdown because I was fishing from my own dock. But she wasn't done yet. That's when she made the call that would change everything. She dialed 911 right there in front of me, never taking her eyes off me as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I need police assistance immediately. There's a trespasser at our community lake who's refusing to leave despite clear warnings. Yes, he's destroying community property. Send someone right away." I watched this performance in amazement. This woman was so convinced of her own authority that she was willing to waste police resources on what was clearly a non-existent problem. While she was on the phone, I went inside and grabbed my property deed, thinking that maybe seeing the official documents would help her understand how wrong she was. When I came back outside with the paperwork, Rebecca was pacing around my deck like she owned the place, muttering about property values and community standards. She kept filming me with her phone, occasionally making comments about how my unauthorized activities were going to be used as evidence in court. The police officer who showed up 20 minutes later was a middle-aged guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Rebecca immediately pounced on him, waving her phone around and launching into a detailed explanation of how I was violating community rules and destroying property values. "Officer, this man is trespassing on private community property in direct violation of our homeowners association guidelines. I've documented everything, and I want him arrested for criminal trespass." The officer looked at me, then at Rebecca, then back at me with an expression that clearly said he was wondering what he'd gotten himself into. I handed him my property deed and fishing license, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. "Officer, I'm fishing from my own property. I bought this cabin 3 months ago and I have all the proper documentation. As far as I know, there's no restriction on residents using the lake." The officer spent several minutes examining both our documents, and I could see him getting more confused by the minute. Rebecca had official-looking HOA paperwork, and I had my legitimate property deed. There was clearly some kind of dispute happening that was way above his pay grade. Finally, he handed everything back to us and delivered his verdict. "This appears to be a property dispute, which is a civil matter. I can't arrest anyone for fishing from their own property. You folks are going to have to work this out between yourselves or through the courts." Rebecca's face went bright red and she started sputtering about how this was unacceptable, and she was going to call the county sheriff and demand action. The officer just shrugged, got back in his patrol car and drove away, leaving me alone with one very angry woman. After the police left, Rebecca stood on my deck for another 10 minutes, making threats about legal action and fines for violating community standards. She warned me that she'd be monitoring my activities and documenting every violation. Finally, she stomped back to her BMW and screeched away, leaving me standing there wondering what kind of neighborhood I'd moved into. That evening, I decided to do some research into the Lakeview Homeowners Association and Rebecca Sterling. What I found was disturbing. According to the community website, Rebecca had been HOA president for 8 years and had a reputation for aggressive enforcement of community rules. There were several complaints from residents about her authoritarian management style and questionable interpretation of HOA authority, but the really interesting thing I discovered was that the lake itself had a complicated legal history. The property records showed that the land around the lake had been owned by a single family for over a century, before being divided up for development in the 80s. The original property boundaries were confusing, and there had been several disputes over lake access rights in the past. That's when I remembered the box of old documents I'd found in the basement when I first moved in. The previous owners had left behind a collection of family papers, old photographs, and historical documents that I'd barely glanced at. But now I was curious. Maybe there was something in those papers that would help me understand the property history. I spent that evening going through the dusty cardboard box, looking at old family photos and reading faded letters. Most of it was just personal correspondence and family memories. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old cloth, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was an original property deed from 1923, written in elegant script on heavy paper that had yellowed with age. The deed was made out to Mitchell Family Trust and described a property that included all lake access rights and riparian privileges for the entirety of Crystal Lake and surrounding timberlands, totaling approximately 500 acres. I stared at this document for a long time, trying to process what I was looking at. My last name was Mitchell. My great-grandfather had lived in Wisconsin, and this deed suggested that my family had once owned not just lake access rights, but the entire lake and most of the land around it. I knew that old property deeds could be complicated, and that ownership could change hands many times over the decades. But this document was raising some very interesting questions about who actually had the legal authority to control lake access, if my family had originally owned the entire property, and if that deed had never been properly superseded. Then Rebecca Sterling might be the one who was trespassing. The next morning, I drove into town and visited the county records office to research the property history. The clerk was helpful and pulled up all the available documents related to Crystal Lake and the surrounding properties. What we found was fascinating. According to the official records, the Mitchell family had indeed owned 500 acres around Crystal Lake from 1923 until 1954, when the property was divided for tax purposes. However, the division had been done for tax assessment reasons, not for actual sale or transfer of ownership. The original deed had never been officially revoked or replaced. This meant that legally, my family might still own the underlying rights to the entire lake, even though the surface property had been divided among multiple owners over the years. It was a complex legal situation that would require expert analysis. But the implications were staggering. If the original Mitchell deed was still valid, then I wasn't just a lake resident with normal property rights. I might actually be the legal owner of the lake itself, which would give me authority over lake access and use. Rebecca Sterling, who claimed to control lake access through the HOA, might have no legal authority whatsoever. I decided to hire a property rights attorney to research the situation thoroughly. The lawyer I chose specialized in historical property disputes and had experience with complicated deed interpretations. She warned me that these cases could take months to resolve and that there were no guarantees, but she was intrigued by what I'd found. While the legal research was underway, Rebecca Sterling wasn't sitting idle. Over the next few weeks, she launched what could only be described as a harassment campaign designed to make my life miserable. She started by having official-looking notices delivered to my cabin, claiming I owed thousands of dollars in fines for continued violations of community standards. The notices were professionally printed and looked legitimate, complete with legal language about enforcement procedures and collection actions. But my attorney assured me that they were essentially meaningless since the HOA had no legal authority to fine non-members for activities on their own property. Rebecca also organized a community meeting to address what she called the unauthorized lake activities problem. According to the meeting announcement, she was proposing new restrictions on lake access that would require all users to obtain permits from the HOA board. The meeting was held on a Tuesday evening at the community center, and I decided to attend to see what kind of support she actually had. The turnout was disappointing for Rebecca. Only 12 people showed up out of a community of over 40 families. Most of the attendees seemed confused about why the meeting was necessary and skeptical of Rebecca's claims about her authority over the lake. Several residents pointed out that they'd been using the lake freely for years without any problems, but Rebecca was determined to push through her agenda. She presented a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Protecting Our Community Assets," that featured photos of me fishing and claims that my activities were attracting undesirable elements to the neighborhood. She proposed a $500 annual fee for lake access permits and threatened legal action against anyone who used the lake without proper authorization. The proposal was met with stunned silence. Finally, an elderly man named Frank raised his hand and asked the obvious question, "Rebecca, what legal authority do you have to charge fees for using a public lake?" Rebecca's response was telling. She got defensive and started talking about property values and community standards, but she couldn't provide any specific legal basis for her claims. When pressed for details, she simply insisted that as HOA president, she had the authority to protect community assets. The meeting ended without any official action being taken, but Rebecca made it clear that she considered the lake access issue far from resolved. She announced that she'd be consulting with attorneys and that formal restrictions would be implemented soon. 2 weeks later, I got the call that changed everything. My property rights attorney had completed her research, and the results were even more dramatic than I'd hoped for. She asked me to come to her office immediately to discuss her findings. "David," she said as I sat down in her conference room, I've spent the last 2 weeks researching your family's property history, and what I've found is remarkable. The original Mitchell deed from 1923 is not only still valid, but it was never properly superseded by subsequent property divisions. She spread out a collection of maps, deeds, and legal documents across the conference table. According to my research, when the property was divided in 1954, it was done for tax assessment purposes only. The actual ownership rights were never transferred. This means that legally, you still own the underlying rights to the entire original property. I stared at the documents, trying to process what she was telling me. What does that mean exactly? It means you own Crystal Lake, all of it. You also own the mineral rights, timber rights, and water rights for the entire 500-acre original property. The people who bought lots around the lake over the years have legitimate ownership of their surface property, but the lake itself legally belongs to you. The implications were staggering. Not only did I have the right to use the lake however I wanted, but Rebecca Sterling had absolutely no authority to restrict my access or anyone else's. In fact, if I chose to exercise my rights as the lake owner, I could potentially restrict her access. There's more, my attorney continued. I've also discovered that Rebecca Sterling has been making false claims about HOA authority for years. She's been collecting fees and fines from residents based on powers that the HOA simply doesn't have. She's potentially committed fraud. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was learning. In the span of 2 weeks, I'd gone from being a simple retiree who wanted to fish in peace to the legal owner of a 500-acre property that included an entire lake and dozens of surrounding homes. What are my options? I asked. My attorney smiled. That depends on what you want to accomplish. You could assert your ownership rights and become a traditional landlord, collecting rent from everyone who lives on your property. You could sell the property to a developer for millions of dollars. You could donate it to the county for public use. Or you could use your legal position to stop Rebecca Sterling's harassment and fraud while allowing the community to continue functioning as it has been. I knew immediately which option appealed to me most. I hadn't moved to Wisconsin to become a landlord or to get rich from real estate deals. I'd come here for peace and quiet to fish and enjoy my retirement. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that Rebecca had been scamming residents and abusing her position for years. The next day, I asked my attorney to prepare a comprehensive legal brief documenting my ownership rights and Rebecca's fraudulent activities. We decided to present this information at the next community meeting and give Rebecca a chance to stop her harassment before taking more serious action. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and word had gotten out that there would be major revelations about lake ownership rights. This time, nearly 30 residents showed up, filling the community center to capacity. Rebecca looked nervous as she called the meeting to order, clearly sensing that something significant was about to happen. I stood up and asked for permission to address the community. Rebecca tried to refuse, claiming that I wasn't a member in good standing of the HOA, but the other residents overruled her and insisted that I be allowed to speak. Neighbors, I began. I moved here 3 months ago hoping for a peaceful retirement. Unfortunately, Mrs. Sterling has been harassing me and making false claims about her authority over Crystal Lake. Tonight, I want to share with you what I've learned about the actual legal status of this property. I presented the historical documents and explained how the property had been divided in 1954 for tax purposes only, while the underlying ownership rights had remained with the Mitchell family. The room was absolutely silent as I explained that I was the legal heir to those rights and that I owned the lake itself. Rebecca's face went white as I continued. Mrs. Sterling has been collecting fees and fines based on authority she simply doesn't have. She's been lying to residents about HOA powers and potentially committing fraud. But more importantly for all of you, she's been creating conflict and division in what should be a peaceful community. The questions came fast and furious. Residents wanted to know what this meant for their property values, their lake access, and their relationship with the HOA. I assured them that I had no intention of disrupting their lives or restricting their lake access. My only goal was to stop Rebecca's harassment and restore peace to the community. Rebecca finally found her voice and launched into a desperate defense of her actions. She claimed that I was trying to destroy property values and that my documents were forgeries designed to support some kind of elaborate scam. But her credibility was shot, and the residents could see right through her desperation. The meeting ended with the community voting unanimously to remove Rebecca Sterling as HOA president and to investigate her financial management of community funds. She stormed out of the meeting, threatening lawsuits and promising that this wasn't over. But it was over. Within a week, my attorney had filed papers with the county officially establishing my ownership rights to Crystal Lake. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a feature article about the retired executive who discovered he owned an entire lake while trying to fish in peace. Rebecca Sterling quietly moved away from the community a month later, and we never saw her again. The new HOA leadership implemented transparent policies and eliminated all the bogus fees and restrictions that Rebecca had imposed over the years. As for me, I got exactly what I'd wanted from the beginning. I wake up every morning, make my coffee, and fish from my dock in perfect peace. The lake is busier now, with more families enjoying the water, but that just makes the community more vibrant and friendly. I never exercised my legal right to charge rent or restrict access. The satisfaction of stopping a bully and protecting my neighbors was worth more than any financial gain. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living well and doing the right thing. The lake that Rebecca Sterling tried to control through intimidation and fraud is now a place where everyone feels welcome. Property values have actually increased since her departure, and the community has become a model of neighborly cooperation. I learned that sometimes the people who scream loudest about their authority are the ones who have the least. Rebecca Sterling spent years building a false empire based on lies and intimidation. But in the end, the truth prevailed and justice was served. These days, when I'm sitting on my dock watching the sunset paint the lake in brilliant colors, I sometimes think about how different things might have been if I'd just given in to Rebecca's demands and stopped fishing. But I'm glad I stood my ground. Sometimes you have to fight for your right to simply live in peace. The moral of this story is simple. Bullies depend on their victims being too intimidated or too uninformed to fight back. But when you know your rights and you're willing to stand up for yourself, even the most aggressive Karen will eventually meet her match. Don't let anyone push you around on your own property, because you never know what cards you might be holding. If this story inspired you to stand up for your rights or reminded you that karma is real, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever had to deal with an HOA Karen or discovered something surprising about property you owned? Share your stories with our community. Thanks for reading. And remember, sometimes the best power is the power you choose not to use. Until next time, keep standing up for what's right.